Next on Secrets of War, the real stories of secret operations behind enemy lines in the Gulf War. The German undercover agent who worked for Iraq. The secret role of the U-2 spy plane. The hunt for mobile Scud missile launchers and the Allied coalition's intelligence blunders. The Gulf War, Secrets in the Sand, is next on Secrets of War.
Parades following the Persian Gulf War of 1991 celebrated something unique in recent American history. Military victory. Operation Desert Storm brought forth an outpouring of affection and respect for the U.S. military not seen since World War II. It seemingly vindicated the enormous and expensive defense modernization of the 1980s and reaffirmed America's status as the world's only remaining superpower. The campaign to evict Saddam Hussein's army from Kuwait was short, with remarkably few coalition casualties. You could call it a feel-good kind of war. But the legacy of that conflict is infinitely more complex. What was once celebrated as victory over evil incarnate was diminished by the Iraqi dictator's continued hold on power. And the conduct of the war, while brilliant in many respects, brought forth troubling consequences. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990 coincided with a massive technological transition in the U.S. military. Sophisticated weapons and information support systems originally developed for use in cold and foggy Central Europe received their baptism of fire in the wind-blown deserts of the Persian Gulf. It was an unexpected location for the first information war. For the first time in the history of conflict, satellites in space would provide navigation and targeting information to tanks, multiple launched rockets, even the individual soldier on the ground. But technology has a price. The devastating firepower of the coalition could not be brought to bear without the constant flow of electrons, rivers of electrons that filled the desert skies and carried the spark of life to tons of otherwise useless steel. With such sophistication comes vulnerability.
Main factor in the Persian Gulf War was superior management of information, aided in large part by the inept management of information, apparently by the opponent, who misused or missed significant opportunities to disrupt our information.
For the U.S. and coalition forces, more time was spent in the effort to collect, evaluate, and disseminate intelligence than in actual fighting. From Special Forces troops operating deep behind enemy lines, to reconnaissance aircraft probing the thin reaches of the atmosphere, war planning revolved around the fundamental quest for information. Even the most primitive sources were enlisted in the effort. Here in the bowels of the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., critical information lay hidden. Intelligence that was needed by General Norman Schwarzkopf to plan the famous left hook, or Hail Mary maneuver of the ground war. This secret plan would drive the main thrust of the coalition's forces through the wastelands of southern Iraq. U.S. Central Command, the joint military command responsible for Persian Gulf security, needed information about the terrain over which hundreds of armored vehicles would have to maneuver. The possibility of a 50-ton Abrams tank bogging down in soft sand threatened to disrupt the entire plan, and satellite imagery was of limited value.
The Library of Congress has the largest collection of maps in the world, numbering some 4.6 million items and 60,000 atlases. We have worldwide coverage dating from the 14th century to the present.
For 3 days, a group of unidentified government employees pored over old archaeological manuscripts, maps, petroleum surveys, anything that would yield up secrets about the desert floor thousands of miles away.
They were interested in the maps that we had had in our collection of the Middle East, large-scale maps, topographic maps, but they included 6 types of vegetation, which would be indicative of the underlying soil.
The revelations found in aging manuscripts and maps was later confirmed by special forces on the ground. The left hook remained as planned. Sometimes perception can distort information, or even render it useless. Saddam Hussein misread the West's reaction to his occupation of Kuwait. He had threatened the vital interests of the world's only remaining superpower. He then provided his adversaries an undisturbed window of almost 6 months to deploy and acclimate nearly 500,000 troops. It resulted in the largest armored and mechanized force to take the field since World War II. Nevertheless, the Iraqi dictator was unimpressed. He perceived the United States as technologically superior, but emotionally impaired by the demons of Vietnam. Glued to their televisions, he reasoned, the American public would have no stomach for the bloody reality of war once a ground battle was joined. But if Saddam Hussein misread the intentions of his adversaries, so was the U.S. handicapped, despite its enormous technical means, by a fundamental misunderstanding of Iraqi motives and capabilities. The nearly decade-long Iran-Iraq War had seen the transformation of Iraq's Republican Guard from a palace defense organization into an elite fighting force of 6 divisions, almost 100,000 men. It was this reconstituted Republican Guard that spearheaded Iraq's victory over Iran in 1988. But it was a qualified victory.
They were able to defeat Iran, and really they were only able to defeat Iran because the depredations of the revolution and the arms embargo had just destroyed Iran's military power. The Iraqis were capable of limited armored offensives, but only in a very set-piece fashion. At any time that the battle diverged from the very careful plan that the Iraqis had developed, they were lost.
This revealing information was all but forgotten in the effort to quantify numbers of Soviet tanks and hardware obtained by the Iraqi military, which led to a flawed assumption that the Iraqis were a Soviet-style army.
The U.S. military, which was primarily focused on the Soviets and had largely ignored the Iran-Iraq War, they were assuming that the Iraqis would fight Soviet style. And we're very fortunate that the Iraqis proved so poor that it didn't really matter ultimately whether they were using British doctrine or Soviet doctrine or anyone else's doctrine.
But Saddam's sea of blood rhetoric had made a strong impression. The Iraqi army had over 1 million men in arms, not including thousands of reservists who'd been demobilized after the long war with Iran. The huge number of casualties in that conflict, coupled with Iraq's willingness to use chemical weapons, was foremost in the minds of coalition planners. Estimates of casualties in a ground war ran into the tens of thousands.
General Schwarzkopf's supply people ordered 15,000 body bags. Well, I'm showing my age a little there. They weren't really body bags. We called them body bags in Vietnam. By the time of Desert Storm, they were called Remain Pouch Human, and then with a long number. But they ordered 15,000 body bags, and the only reason you have body bags is to place bodies in them.
The high casualty estimates reflected an exaggerated opinion of Iraqi capabilities. This failure to correctly assess information would have a significant impact on the planning and execution of the ground campaign. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait on the 2nd of August, 1990, was the first real test of the West's post-Cold War intelligence capabilities. Less than a month before, the Defense Intelligence Agency in Washington had only 2 people assigned to issues involving Iraq and the Iraqi military. Conversely, there were 42 personnel working on prisoner-of-war matters stemming from the Vietnam War.
We were facing 100,000 plus deployed Iraqi troops in August of 1990, and we had deployed opposite them exactly 0. We had to very rapidly get enough people in theater to respond to the Iraqi presence. Only then did you want to begin to bring in intelligence and other support organizations. So in many ways they were operating blind for the first approximately 2 months.
The effort to organize a working intelligence apparatus in Saudi Arabia to support CENTCOM commanders was plagued by difficulties. One of the immediate problems was an insufficient telecommunications capacity. The Defense Intelligence Agency even considered leasing satellite time from the Soviet Union as a solution.
Intelligence information swallows up an awful lot of capacity on a satellite. You're sending images. You're not sending voice, you're sending images. And that takes an immense quantity of time and space on the satellite. Eventually they did some workarounds, and in the end they did not have to lease anything. But they said they were very seriously considering it.
Never before in military history had so much imagery from spy satellites been requested in the theater of operations. Previously restricted to high-level Washington policymakers and senior military commanders, massive quantities of satellite imagery were transmitted by the CIA directly to CENTCOM headquarters in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. But once there, the precious images frequently fell victim to a combination of other problems, such as hoarding by senior staff and insufficient distribution capabilities. The result was frequent intelligence logjams.
The speed of communications, the volume of communications drives the amount of information that's available. Higher expectations, I guess would be a way to describe it. For the Gulf War, imagery couldn't be more than 12 hours or 24 hours old.
The Gulf War also saw the first use of new battlefield intelligence systems that were originally developed for use in Europe. The E-8 Joint Surveillance and Target Attack Radar System, known as JSTARS, was operated jointly by the Army and Air Force. It had a functionally limited but nevertheless promising debut in identifying ground targets for coalition strike aircraft. But JSTARS was still under development and deployed despite the fact that entire components were missing. The only two existing prototypes arrived in Saudi Arabia on the 12th of January, just 2 days before the start of the air war. Using a powerful 25-foot side-looking radar mounted underneath the fuselage, the system is designed to detect stationary and slow-moving vehicles on the ground at ranges of more than 150 miles. A moving target indicator displays target information that can then be relayed to airborne strike aircraft or to ground receiving stations. But under operational conditions in the Gulf, JSTARS could not distinguish between wheeled and tracked vehicles, nor could it provide precise targeting data to either aircraft or ground troops.
They would tell us that there were large numbers of vehicles at a certain large location, but they would just tell us that they were MTIs, moving target indicators. We had no idea what they were. Many times it proved to be us. They would call us and tell us our location, and we'd say, thanks very much, we know that.
Nevertheless, JSTARS was valuable. The coalition's strategy depended on striking targets behind Iraqi lines, and JSTARS was able to detect supply convoys, assembly areas, and retreat routes. Considering its state of development and the fact that most of the crew were civilian employees of the manufacturer, Grumman Corporation, JSTARS was a qualified success. It was also a public relations goldmine. The U.S. Air Force planned to purchase 19 improved JSTARS. With millions of dollars at stake, the war's real airborne intelligence hero went unheralded. The venerable Lockheed U-2 spy plane.
After the war, the JSTARS received a lot of publicity and a lot of plaudits for its undoubted success. It was still a developmental system, and the Air Force was looking for funding for the production aircraft, so they were also keen to publicize its successes, as well as the manufacturer. The U-2, however, did not receive much publicity from the Air Force. Indeed, some of the sensors were still classified.
The U-2's role in the Gulf marked the evolution of this one-time Cold War icon into an unequaled tactical intelligence platform.
And while the airframe itself was rather low-tech, the sensors that it carried were decidedly high-tech. Its value lay in its ability to be retasked quickly, to loiter and orbit over areas of interest, and to do the job at relatively low cost compared with satellites, which are both very expensive and very inflexible, and their satellite orbit patterns are very predictable.
Originally designed in the late 1950s to overfly the Soviet Union with powerful cameras, the U-2 was transformed into a high-flying modular intelligence truck. With a speed of only 430 miles an hour, it operated at extreme altitudes, with a range of over 3,000 miles. Its various sensors could cover an area 180 kilometers wide and over 5,000 kilometers long on a single mission. During the Gulf War, as many as 12 U-2s were used, with a combination of 5 sensor packages. These ranged from electro-optical cameras to a signals intelligence package for eavesdropping on communications. Electronic data could be digitally relayed to satellites or to ground stations in near real time. At the request of CENTCOM war planners, traditional wet film cameras were also brought into the theater. These cameras provided both wide area and telescopic coverage of Iraqi positions and other targets. The H2 camera with its 66-inch folding lens was brought out of retirement. Of all the U-2 sensors, probably the most widely used was its special radar system that could produce extremely detailed all-weather ground maps, which in turn could be downlinked to mobile receiving stations. In one of the war's best-kept secrets, the U-2 actually supported J-STARS, which used its moving target indicator to track Iraqi vehicles on the ground. The J-STARS would alert the U-2 with its higher resolution radar to create a ground map of the area. This remarkable ad hoc combination provided some of the most valuable targeting intelligence available to coalition forces. The best airborne systems, however, can never replace the essential eyes and ears of a soldier on the ground. Special Operations Forces, or Spec Ops, are an essential but complex weapon in the theater commander's arsenal, particularly in a large-scale conventional war, as was fought in the Gulf. Special operations are, by their very nature, unconventional. The emphasis on the daring and technical skill of how Spec Ops functioned left unanswered a fundamental question. Did they accomplish the mission? In the Gulf War, the results were mixed. Special Operations Forces initially arrived in Saudi Arabia to conduct internal defense training for Arab coalition members.
Schwarzkopf never trusted his Arab coalition forces. He needed people on the ground with these forces to provide what the military calls ground truth, to tell him exactly what the capabilities of these forces were. So you had Green Beret lieutenants, sergeants, captains, majors, in many cases, standing right next to Arab colonels, generals, whispering in their ears in their own language, making sure that everybody was going to be singing off the same sheet of music when they attacked.
British and U.S. Special Operations teams also carried out intelligence and deep penetration missions. In this arena, their success is obscured by secrecy. Their mission was one of the most controversial of the war. Saddam Hussein's response to the opening of what was called Operation Desert Storm, the offensive air campaign that began on the 17th of January, was to launch Scud ballistic missiles against Israel and Saudi Arabia. These attacks, although militarily insignificant, threatened to destabilize the fragile coalition, particularly if Israel were to enter the war by retaliating against Iraq. Stationary or fixed Scud sites in western Iraq had been located early on by aerial reconnaissance and were a priority target in the first round of airstrikes. It was Iraq's mobile Scud launchers, less than 25, that were to be the source of so much contention. They also directly impacted the role of special operations.
The Scud attack had a tremendous psychological value, particularly for Saddam Hussein. He sent an entire nation into panic. And when the Israelis went into panic, their political and military leadership started to bring incredible pressure on the White House and the Pentagon to knock out those Scuds.
The idea of using Special Operations Forces to search for the elusive missiles was not embraced by Schwarzkopf. He didn't trust the so-called snake eaters.
The distrust of special operations is cultural, and it's almost historical in the U.S. military. Most of the wars the U.S. military fights can be characterized fairly simply. They're very violent, they're very overwhelming. Schwarzkopf was a product of traditional military thinking in that sense.
On the other hand, Lieutenant General Sir Peter de la Billière, the commander of British forces deployed to the Gulf, viewed the Scud problem as an excellent opportunity for special operations involvement. He was a longtime member of the SAS, the Special Air Service, after which the U.S. Special Forces were modeled.
I think he managed to persuade Schwarzkopf this would be a good idea. Basing it on de La Billiere's own experience. Schwarzkopf trusted de La Billiere's word on this. And so we did then start to see special forces being deployed.
Resembling the long-range desert groups of World War II fame, 5 British teams slipped across the border into Iraq in January of 1991. One of these was from A Squadron, 22nd SAS Regiment. For operational security, their faces are not revealed.
The mission was a directive. Get out there, seek, locate and destroy anything that you find within your area of operation, which incidentally was roughly the size of Scotland. But what was significant about that area, the southwest part of Iraq, was at that time it was starting to become the launch pad, if you like, for Scuds into Saudi and Israel.
The 30 men of A Squadron traveled in a convoy of 6 modified Land Rovers, 2 off-road motorbikes, and a 1-ton Mercedes Unimog, affectionately known as the mother truck. The routine of the convoy was governed by the movement of the sun across the wide horizon. Move and strike by night, hide in a lying-up position, or LUP, by day. To the untrained eye, the LUP might appear to be simple camouflage netting thrown haphazardly over parked vehicles.
At least 50% of the regiment's time in Iraq was spent in an LUP. We live and work in that LUP. And that means everybody lives by their own vehicle under the camnets. It's a strange existence, because here you are in the middle of a desert, vast expanse of real estate, but you're being forced to exist in an area probably about 5 or 6 feet square under a bit of a camnet at the back of the vehicle. Everything's done over a huddle, so you're trying to keep low from your camnet.
3 days after crossing the border, the convoy's LUP was approached by an Iraqi jeep. It moved slowly towards the strange-looking camouflage lumps in the desert. Then, 2 Iraqi soldiers got out.
2 Iraqis started to walk towards our vehicles, assuming that we were an Iraqi unit under these camnets, because the camnets didn't conceal what we were, just concealed who we were.
When they reached the netting, both men died instantly. In the dead of night, A Squadron had stumbled into a region occupied by an Iraqi artillery division. If they were going to leave the area alive, all traces of their presence would have to be removed. The Iraqi jeep was demolished with explosives.
It was very important that no signature remained of what had happened. That means remains of the bodies, blood remains, everything totally cleared up. It was not beyond the realms of possibility that they may just have got lost. But if they could tie it down to a definite contact, we'd have problems.
The squadron switched to daytime patrols after the ground war was launched in February. A large Union Jack was prominently displayed near the vehicles as a precaution against friendly fire from coalition aircraft. During an incredible 6 weeks behind Iraqi lines, A Squadron attacked a vital communications site called Victor II and reported on targets for airstrikes. They were personally congratulated by General Norman Schwarzkopf. The SAS experience exemplifies the skill and resourcefulness of Special Operations Forces in the Gulf. Translating that bravery and motivation into locating mobile Scud launchers, however, was another matter. A thorough investigation of the subject undertaken by the U.S. Air Force in their Gulf War Air Power Survey found it impossible to confirm that even a single mobile Scud was ever destroyed. Despite the commitment of over 2,500 coalition aircraft sorties and the best efforts of U.S. and British special forces. Furthermore, evidence that Israel would have taken direct action against the Scuds is not clear. What is certain is that Israel was exerting tremendous political pressure on Washington.
At several points during the Scud attacks, the Israelis let our satellites know that their missiles that are nuclear armed were ready, waiting, and on the launch pad and could attack.
Revealed in these satellite images is Israel's secret nuclear weapons complex, located at Zachariah, several miles southeast of Tel Aviv. A Jericho-2 ballistic missile has been moved from its shelter and is positioned for launching.
They had a ladder of escalation based on what the possible outcomes were for Scud attacks. And as we know, this ladder of escalation went right the way up to nuclear weapons. But Israel was not going to attack unless there was a large-scale loss of life and/or Iraqi chemical weapons were used. The kind of attacks which were made on Israel did not come within the terms of the ladder of escalation principle. So in that sense, it is a myth that the Scud hunt kept the Israelis out of the war.
A startling and unexpected postscript to the Scud episode came to light by way of Germany. In 1990, Jürgen Mohammed Gittler worked as an archivist in the German Foreign Ministry in Bonn. As a convert to Islam, he was passionately committed to the Arab cause. In February of that year, Gittler had a chance meeting with the Iraqi military attaché at this downtown restaurant. In that meeting, Gittler boasted that he could obtain sensitive classified documents. He was counting on the surprisingly lax security of the foreign ministry.
A complete lack of security. I didn't walk around there with a camera wearing a trench coat. I simply made photocopies and quite openly took them out of there. You know, simply locked up in my briefcase.
In May of 1991, after turning over hundreds of top-secret documents over a 6-month period, the overconfident Gittler was quietly arrested and charged with espionage by the German counterintelligence agency. Following a secret trial, he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. It was not until 1997 that the confidential transcripts of the court proceedings were obtained by the German magazine Der Spiegel.
Some of the most important documents Gittler took were documents about the knowledge of the American government about Iraqi missile sites. And we have the suspicion that some of the reasons why the Allied forces were not able to hit the missile sites was that the Iraqi knew what the West knew and just changed the missile sites.
Did Jürgen Mohammed Gittler help defeat the hunt for Scuds during the Gulf War? The German court thought so, in light of the Iraqis' ability to hide their missiles or to replace them with decoys. And there's no question that many of these dummy Scuds were attacked. The significant military insights the court wrote in handing down the guilty verdict gave Iraq considerable advantages. Gittler was released from prison in 1994.
He thinks that he did it in the best interest of the Arab countries, and in a very strange way, he's obviously very proud about this.
My unconditional yes to Iraq and its president Saddam Hussein still stands. It stands as firm as ever.
One of the sobering lessons of the Gulf War is that 50 years after Hitler's V-2s wreaked havoc in southern England and Belgium, there is still no effective defense against mobile ballistic missiles. To the extent that it diverted precious coalition military assets, Saddam Hussein's Scud campaign was his only real success in the war. Even before the onset of the Scud attacks, General Schwarzkopf's planning efforts for the ground war had become mired in frustration. U.S. intelligence had overestimated the size and strength of the Iraqi forces.
We saw numbers as high as 540,000, modern equipment, the vaunted Republican Guards, almost invincible. I called it a fourth-rate army, and when I did that in my book, the U.S. Army became very upset with that. But they weren't even a fourth-rate. But still, you know, they were an army, they had weapons, they had several 100,000 of them, but they were nowhere near what was purported to be. While the Air Force was laying out a detailed air campaign, the ground campaign was foundering, just foundering. He couldn't come up with a way that everyone would accept to kick Saddam out of Kuwait.
The preliminary offensive plan that CENTCOM produced was based on the number of U.S. troops then in Saudi Arabia, approximately 215,000. It called for a so-called straight-up-the-middle attack directly into the teeth of the enemy's defenses. No one liked the plan, not even Schwarzkopf. President Bush and Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney were horrified at the projected casualties. The response from the Bush administration to the up-the-middle proposal was immediate and unambiguous.
They said, well, what do you need to do a good plan? They said, I need twice as many forces. They said, you got it. And that's when they sent the 7th Corps from Germany and additional forces over. And the addition of those additional forces, 8 divisions of Army and a couple of divisions of Marine Corps, gave General Schwarzkopf options, including the option to do the left hook.
The ground plan that finally emerged had 3 closely coordinated elements. Diversionary amphibious operations off the coast, the 1st and 2nd Marine Divisions attacking directly into Kuwait, and a knockout blow provided by 2 Army Corps, the 7th and 18th, attacking and enveloping the main Iraqi force from the west. They would also block western escape routes and destroy the Republican Guards. One of the most extraordinary military achievements of the Gulf War took place while the Allied bombing campaign effectively blinded the Iraqis. The coalition moved over 250,000 soldiers and 64,000 tanks and other vehicles 300 miles into western Saudi Arabia in preparation for the western envelopment. This mass repositioning is considered one of the most successful deceptions in military history. In the early morning hours of the 24th of February, 1991, the firepower, speed, and agility of the coalition ground forces were brought to bear against the Iraqis. The final act of Operation Desert Storm would last only 100 hours. Less than 4 days. That the coalition prevailed came as a surprise to no one. What stunned Schwarzkopf's commanders was the swiftness of the Iraqi collapse. The speed of the Marine frontal attack into Kuwait and the corresponding flight of Iraqi forces to the north toward Basra threw the carefully planned timetable of events off kilter. Suddenly, a campaign of maneuver and contact turned into one of hot pursuit. Facing a rapidly changing situation, and deprived of good information on the strength of the Iraqi forces in its path, 7th Corps chose not to deviate from the original plan of advance, a controversial decision. What was to have been a demonstration of swift maneuver and envelopment resembled instead the spoke of a giant, ponderous wheel with 5 divisions perfectly aligned.
The U.S. ground offensive, and particularly the movement of 7th Corps, was done in a very carefully orchestrated fashion. This gave the Iraqis considerable time to retreat out of Kuwait and also to form up a defensive line, a screening force of Republican Guard divisions.
For some members of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, whose reconnaissance function at the front relied on speed and surprise, their choice of a World War II icon for inspiration only heightened the sense of frustration at the slow pace.
Rommel was the Desert Fox for a reason. And it was because he took maneuver warfare in the desert to a high art. We captured an Iraqi major and had a picture of Rommel on my turret shield door. He did a real double take when he saw the picture of Rommel on the turret shield door, and I had a private in there guarding him. This is wonderful things about young American soldiers. The Iraqi major says to the private, "Why do you have a picture of one of your enemies in your tank?" And the private says to him, "Well, if you knew a little bit more about Rommel, you wouldn't be sitting in the back of my track, would you?"
Brief but sharp armored engagements with the Republican Guard defensive screen did occur. The Gulf War was a showcase for the M1A1 Abrams tank. A study in angular, sculpted power, this 50-ton, turbine-driven monster swept across the sands with a high-pitched whine that belied its lethal punch. The Abrams dominated tank combat. It outgunned the best Iraqi contender, the Russian-made T-72, in every engagement. Its superior fire control and thermal imaging system allowed crews to fire on the move, achieving first-round kills at an incredible 3,000 meters. But the key ingredient responsible for this devastation was never discussed publicly. Although it has existed in the U.S. arsenal since the late 70s, the Gulf War marked its combat debut. No armor will stop it. Tank crews called it the Silver Bullet. Stark images of turretless tanks bear mute witness to the violent efficiency of modern-day armored combat. Hapless Iraqi tank crews were the first to experience the blinding flash of death from the Silver Bullet.
I saw one T-72 destroyed in which it literally disappeared as a vehicle, leaving a giant crater in the road. Many of the T-72s, when hit with the M1A1 tank gun, the turret would explode and fly off the vehicle as far as 50 to 150 feet.
Only after the war was this weapon's startling secret revealed. It is radioactive. The official U.S. military designation for this tank-killing ammunition is M829, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sable. It is essentially a heavy metal dart or penetrator made from depleted uranium or DU. The round's muzzle velocity of 1,500 meters a second, combined with its high density, provides extreme accuracy. The DU penetrator kills by pure kinetic energy. No explosive charge is needed.
But it has another very important property that makes it so effective on the battlefield. It's what scientists would say was pyrophoric. Literally burn on impact. It'll weld a hole through the strongest of tank armors.
As it goes in, there's radioactive heavy metal spalling, which is the uranium pieces breaking off, which can catch fire. And now we have a shower of, so to speak, BBs that are extremely heavy, moving very fast, and on fire.
As fuel and ammunition inside the tank ignite, the result, more often than not, is a catastrophic explosion. Kinetic energy penetrators were developed during the 1970s to counter what was thought to be advanced Soviet tank armor. The heavy-density properties of depleted uranium were well known, and nuclear waste, already cheap and plentiful, provided a ready source for DU ammunition. The Pentagon's enthusiasm for depleted uranium was not limited to the Abrams tank. The Air Force A-10, with its 30mm Gatling gun, was actually responsible for most of the depleted uranium released in the Gulf. Some 630,000 pounds of it.
What makes depleted uranium so effective as a weapon is also what makes it so dangerous to soldiers, and that is it burns on impact, literally releasing oxidized particles of uranium that can be inhaled, ingested by anyone who comes in contact with, say, a tank or a bunker that was hit by a depleted uranium shell.
Fortunately for the coalition, the Iraqis didn't have DU ammunition in 1991. However, 8 Abrams tanks and 15 Bradley fighting vehicles were struck by DU rounds, victims of so-called friendly fire by other Abrams. 12 Bradley crew members were killed and 43 were wounded. During the recovery of these vehicles, the scope of DU contamination and exposure in the Gulf was revealed.
When our depleted uranium team arrived on site to start to assess and clean up the damaged and destroyed equipment, we found out rapidly, first off, that no safety precautions had been taken, nor had the individuals been informed of the hazards associated with depleted uranium.
Because of the degree of radioactive contamination, 6 of the friendly fire Bradley vehicles had to be buried in place in Saudi Arabia. But what of the soldiers? Not only those who were wounded by friendly fire, but the potential thousands of U.S. and coalition troops who were exposed on the battlefield while looking over destroyed Iraqi equipment or simply inhaling the pervasive smoke. In spite of conclusive post-war analysis conducted by the Army, the Pentagon consistently downplayed the severity of depleted uranium exposures during the Gulf War. Indications are that many soldiers were never informed of possible DU contamination. Dr. Asaf Durakovich, a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, was a radiation safety officer for the Veterans Administration.
It should be remedied instantly by involving the experts and professionals in management and diagnostic care of those patients, and making sure that certain risk assessment will be given to each one of them, so they will not be in the constant fear of what might happen to them tomorrow.
The Army remains conflicted over its super weapon. A congressionally mandated DU training program was completed in 1995, but not implemented. To the man once responsible for passing on this information, it remains a mission uncompleted.
We were tasked to complete a job, to identify the problems, to clean up a mess, to develop the training to ensure medical care is provided for those people that were exposed to this hazard of war. We got to finish it.
Doug Rockey is himself suffering from the effects of depleted uranium exposure. Information, a simple word with profound implications. From the day in August 1990 that Iraq crossed the border into Kuwait, the demand for information never ceased. Through the very last day of the war, the 28th of February, intelligence operations churned through vast amounts of data to comprehend the ground situation. Ground truth, however, was never fully attained.
We bombed the Iraqis to smithereens. Yet, without the aid of any high-tech communications equipment, Saddam's generals were able to execute a retreat under the most severest of conditions. Maybe they did it with motorcycles and notes, I don't know, but they did it. We had all the equipment in the world, and we couldn't prevent it.
May God bless our valiant military forces and their families.
After 100 hours of ground combat, President Bush ordered a ceasefire. The Republican Guards, Saddam Hussein's trusted protectors of the realm, escaped to fight another day. Kuwait was liberated, but Saddam Hussein's continued presence and the conflict's undetermined physical toll is a somber reminder that superior technology has yet to lift the fog of war.